So good afternoon and welcome. I'm Susan Murray. I'm director of the David Hume Institute. And for those of you joining us for the first time, the David Hume Institute is an independent think tank established in 1985 to increase the diversity of thought on the economy and issues related to public policy around it. A link to our website is in the Zoom chat. And if you'd like to find out more about our work, please have a look at that and do have a good read through. Now, just before we get started, there are a few things about how the event will run. I will welcome everyone, and as I do, please introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like to say hello and connect yourself with others. There are automated closed captions available through Zoom, so please click the button on your screen if you'd like to see these throughout the event. There will be approximately 20 minutes of the research presentation and panel conversation before we move into questions from the audience. For the question, please post them in the Q&A, and then we'll invite you to unmute so you can ask your question directly. And when asking your question, please state your name and, if applicable, your organisation. If you're unable to unmute, please let us know and I can ask the question for you. As we near the end of the event, I may group the questions so that we can get through as many as possible. Now, this event is being recorded and I will share it will be available on our website afterwards, so you can watch it again or share with colleagues. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our panelists for today's discussion, Manish, Joshi and Theresa Shearer. Manish is an experienced trustee and chief executive. He currently leads Strathclyde Students' Union, a charity which provides representation to the university's 24,000 students on academic matters, as well as providing access to over 200 clubs, societies, 53 sports clubs, volunteering opportunities, social events, and lots of other businesses around the Strathclyde University. Theresa is Chief Executive of Enable Group. She leads 2,200 staff and supports over 6,500 people who have a learning disability or additional support need and their families across Scotland. Theresa continues to combine her CEO role with a voluntary position supporting leadership and governance in the third sector. And in December 2021, she was elected Vice President of Inclusion Europe. We'll hear from Manish and Theresa shortly, but first I'm going to take a few moments to give you an overview of the research. So Lucy, can you share the slides, please? Now, the research we're going to discuss today has its origins in the David Hume Institute's previous work, where we analysed the diversity of the top leaders across lots of sectors in Scotland. Now, why is diversity of thought important? Because it helps you avoid the pitfalls of groupthink. It improves risk management, productivity and innovation. And that's why a think tank was set up to look at the economy and related public policy is investigating this, because it matters who is making decisions that affect the economy and our society. Last summer, we did an additional supplement on the business and investment sector leaders in Scotland, and we felt this had been underrepresented in previous samples. It had fascinating findings, and you can read about this on our website. And there was also an event about it in November that you can watch too. Today, our attention is on the diversity of charity leaders in Scotland, a sector which touches all aspects of our lives every day. Now, the context for this is an organisation can only become a charity if it meets the charity test, meaning that it must show it has only charitable purposes. To be described as a charity in Scotland, organisations must register with the Scottish charity regulator, known as OSCR. For the first time, we've analysed leaders in the top 300 registered charities by income. These are identified from the Scottish Charity Register. Lucy, can you go to the second slide, please? The top 300 represent just 1% of the total number of charities in Scotland, but have a combined annual income of over £10 billion a year. That is 73% of the sector's total annual income from just 1% of the organisations. Now, over the last 4 months, we've analysed the chair and chief executive positions, or their equivalents, because sometimes they have different names in each of those organisations. We've used openly available data from websites, LinkedIn profiles, media coverage, as well as contacting some individuals where this wasn't available. We analysed gender, age, ethnicity, education and professional background, but we were unable to ascertain some other forms of diversity using these open data sources. We identified 545 leaders in total, as not every organisation has top 2 leadership positions. Some people in the sample have more than one role, and a few of them we were not able to identify. We found 1 in 25 of the leaders connected to more than one charity in the top 300 list. So they were only counted once in the organisation that had the highest income. And all but one of these was in the same category of organisation. So it didn't affect really the overall results. Now let's move on for a whistle-stop tour of an overview of the results. Overall, we found in a sector where the majority of the workforce is female, only 1 in 3 or 34% of the top leaders is female, and only 1 in 50 or 2% are from an ethnic minority background. Looking further into the ethnic diversity breakdown, whilst it might be possible to argue that the overall result isn't too different from the overall population of Scotland, 56% of the charities analysed in this study operate in cities of Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen, where the ethnic diversity is more concentrated. There's a pie chart that shows this on the next slide. In Edinburgh, the percentage of the population that identifies an ethnic minority is 17.9%. In Glasgow, it's 17.3%, and in Aberdeen, 17.1%. So this is very different from the overall results we found. Moving on to look at age, as with our analysis of the business and investment sector, we see a concentration of leaders born in the 50s and 60s. There is a slight variation between chair and chief executive roles. Chairs have a wider variation in age, with a sample including people born in the 1940s as well as the 1990s. Now, within the top 300, there are many types of organisation and purpose. So there are charities that are called charitable trusts, registered social landlords, universities, colleges, schools, arm's length organisations, as well as health and social care charities. So we broke down the sample of the top 300, and the next slide shows how this turned out. All of these are registered charities in Scotland. The sample does not include cross-border charities who are regulated in Northern Ireland, England or Wales. The graph shows the breakdown of organisations by total number in the category, as well as by the percentage of the total income of the sample. So if you remember, the total annual income of this group is £10 billion. Registered social landlords have the highest number of the type of organisation, but universities and colleges dominate the total annual income at £5 billion. When we looked further into gender diversity by category, there were significant differences across the sample. The graph shows the breakdown. Health and care and housing has the most gender diversity, with religion and schools the least. But it's worth noting that 6 out of the 10 categories have less than 25% of female leaders, and this gets masked in the overall sample. Now, moving on to look at undergraduate education, again, there's a significant difference across the categories. 50% of all charity leaders analysed went to an elite university, so this is classed as Oxford, Cambridge, one of the Scottish Ancients, or another Russell Group university. 6% of all charity leaders attended Oxford or Cambridge at undergraduate level, and schools and funders had the highest percentage of elite university alumni at 77 and 69% respectively. Charities working overseas but based in Scotland had the highest number of leaders who did not attend university. And we also looked at postgraduate education, where we found 43% of the sample had a postgraduate degree, and 20% of these had an MBA. Now, looking at professional background, the most common background before holding the leadership role was the public sector for both chairs and chief executives. And this was closely followed by finance as the background for chairs and housing for chief executives. And breaking down the sample in this way showed that chair roles are dominated by individuals from traditional professional roles of finance, business, politics and law, as well as the public sector. Our analysis found that there is more chance of your CEO and chair having different backgrounds in the charity sector than in other sectors within the Team Scotland series of analysis, which shows there is more diversity of thought between leaders in this sector. One of the other things we noticed through the analysis was the importance of the availability of data, and there was a correlation with the type of organisation. So we found a graph from Oscar, and it got us thinking about how transparency might be changing over time. And this graph shows about new registered charities, but it shows since the advent of SCIOs, or Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation, there's been a dramatic decline in the number of charities that are also limited companies. Now, this new form of charity was designed to save organisations time by just reporting to one regulator. However, an unintended consequence has been less requirement for transparency because company directors have to register their details with Companies House and are part of the publicly searchable register. Some other observations from the research is the top 300 are very different from the majority of the charities in Scotland in terms of their size and scale. If a member of the public was asked to name a charity, there were very few names that might immediately come to mind in the top 300. OSCR reports that trust is at its highest level since they began measuring in 2009, and all registered charities benefit from these high levels of trust in the charity brand. Now, we found it much harder to find out about some of the organisations than when we analysed the business leaders, where everyone's identifiable on Companies House. And it was also harder to find out about leaders who hold multiple positions across a number of organisations, meaning they would be controlling very significant levels of resources. Now, Lucy, if you can go to the last slide. The bottom line of this is diversity matters to our economy and society, and we need every leader and every organisation to do more to champion change. Every leader can challenge themselves with basic questions on their own assumptions and choices, and every leader can find out how people from different backgrounds experience their organisations and find out how their own organisation is measuring progress. And every leader involved in recruitment can champion diversity throughout the selection progress. Now, we know what gets measured gets done, and as with other Team Scotland analysis, we recommend specific and public measurement of diversity in senior leadership and management teams. Now, gathering and analysing this data took 4 months, which is longer than we had expected. And despite the public responsibilities of these organisations, we found it harder than other sectors we had looked at previously. As the charity sector controls significant resources and has significant power and influence, we are calling for a publicly accessible and searchable register of charity trustees. We see no reason why company directors should be required to have a higher level of transparency than charity leaders. Now, this would require an amendment in charity law in Scotland to enable OSCR to host the publicly searchable trustee register similar to Companies House. However, there's already been a consultation in 2019 where 71% of respondents supported the publicly searchable register of trustees. And we believe that the public benefit duty on charities means that there should be more requirement for transparency than for company directors, not less. I'm delighted to share this research with you today, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections. Now, first, over to Manish. What do you think about the research? Was it what you expected? And were there any surprises?
Thanks, Susan. Thanks for that overview, and thanks for having me here today. You know, in some respects, I'm not surprised, but at the same time, I think when you see it written down on paper, it's quite alarming when you actually start to recognise, I guess, the scale of the challenge before the sector, but I guess also within society, because the figures are broadly representative, I think, of some of the barriers that we see across society as well. And so I think often in the third sector, I think we hold ourselves to a higher standard, or we think we hold ourselves to a higher standard, and we're more socially progressive than we sometimes actually are. So I think seeing the figures in black and white kind of brought that home and brought that to light. From my perspective, I think the power dynamic was interesting when you look at, you know, you've got 300 organisations with 73% that make up 73% of the income of the sector. It's such a wide and varied sector, and you know, I'm sure there's people on the call today who come from charities that don't have those levels of income. And I think, where does the power lie in these discussions? Where's the role of leadership, I think, within these discussions too? So, you know, are those with the kind of broadest shoulders carrying the burden, helping to lead in the sector, helping to transfer knowledge and experience? You know, I'm not sure where that's happening, and if we've got a good understanding of how that's happening. The average age of trustees, again, I think I maybe have my own bias on that. I've worked at Students' Union, so I'm surrounded by younger people. My board's made up predominantly of students. both undergrad and postgrad students on that, but they're certainly not of the average age that we've got within the findings. I think part of the challenge there is, again, how people can access some of these opportunities. You know, do they take place during the working day? Is there flexibility from our employers? Are people encouraged within their places of work to volunteer their time or to use these opportunities for learning and development? So I think a lot of the issues that you've highlighted in the report are actually structural issues that exist within our organisation, the structural issues that exist within society. You know, I think there are lots of really interesting programmes that are already out there to encourage younger people to get onto boards. And, you know, running a student union with 25,000 students here at Strathclyde, who I'm sure would love to talk to people about potentially getting onto their board. So happy to have a conversation with folks around that. And I guess just touching on that HE perspective there, so that, you know, I was surprised, I think, at the number of people that came from elite institutions. You know, I think, again, across Scotland, we're probably one of the most highly educated populations in Europe. And I would have maybe expected a broader cross-section there. But again, how much bias do we have when we're appointing people, that we maybe look at the CV and, you know, appoint people because we know the institution? How much of it is there of kind of tapping people on the shoulder and people that you already know because of networks that exist from university time? So I think there's a real challenge there. And then the lack of transparency, I think, in terms of who sits on boards. I was actually talking to my wife about this, and she was surprised, you know, and I think other people would be surprised that there's not a register of people who sit on boards. You know, I think you can go on the Companies House and search for that. And I think, you know, transparency and accountability to me are two elements of, you know, what do we do with the findings from this? You know, who holds us accountable? You know, the board should be holding each other accountable in terms of the work they're doing, but where's the, I guess, the sectoral accountability on it as well? And I think just kind of final points from me, you know, where obviously I think you tried to do a lot of this research from looking at what was available, what was in the public domain. And I think, you know, the fact that there's no leaders identified with a visible disability. You know, I'm sure Theresa will talk about that more, but that was just something that struck me, is the fact that, you know, we talk a lot about race and class, and, you know, I think disability seems to be one that we've got a long way to go still, in making sure that we're actually creating pathways for people to be able to get to positions. And, you know, the pandemic has hopefully opened lots of people's eyes in leadership positions to the fact that you can offer flexible working, that you can adapt people's workplaces. But it was interesting, I guess, that we maybe don't have leaders who are vocal about their disabilities within the sector. So those were maybe some of the takeaways from me, but I thought it was a really interesting piece of work. And I think for me, it's what we do with it now that we kind of have these findings.
Thanks, Manish. I nearly had to do the you're on mute thing. Theresa, what do you think?
Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me here today, Susan. I am, of course, delighted to talk about diversity in all forms, as Manish talked about, in terms of gender, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, that whole plethora of DE&I, which we're all grappling with as leaders within the sector. What did I think? So I am a woman born in the 70s, who's chief exec of one of the charities that you've identified. I've held vice chair and VP roles within boards, so have a really good understanding, I think, of the sector. So I suppose, given that background, I wasn't hugely surprised, Susan, and that's actually the part that's quite disappointing. So why was I not hugely surprised? I think your research very much mirrored what some of my experience has been. It very much mirrored what I hear when I'm talking to other people who are on boards or on executive positions. And it very much mirrors, I think, the fact that we want to do something different. And I think we particularly want to do something different in Scotland. I've really seen that post-pandemic and during the pandemic. But I think what the research showed us was we are not as diverse as we think we are. I mean, that goes without saying. You only have to read the figures and you see the numbers for yourself. In some sectors, we're a little bit more diverse than others. And I was pleased to see health and social care in particular, but still a huge disparity between mirroring our workforce and mirroring our customer base in terms of the people we serve and our charitable beneficiaries. So that was my second point. And my third point was probably linked to what Manish was saying. There's a lot of great research, but I think what's really great about the research is it points us to particular actions and solutions. So all too often, and we see this, those of us who are active in social media, we see it often where research is published and people talk about constantly an admiration of the problem. You know, we know what some of these issues are, but actually, what do we need to do in order to change the dial and to move some of those numbers forward? And I think that was my third point, which is I see some things from the report that I think are quite tactical. So Manish talked about young trustees and bringing in people with disabilities and really sort of widening what we do in an individual organisational perspective. And I think that's on us to do that. So we are the chief execs, we are the chairs. We shouldn't need David Hume to point us in that direction as people who are in those privileged positions today. That's 101 of being a chief exec and being on a charity board, and we should all be doing that. But I think the problem is deeper than individual action and actually will take a much more systemic approach to how we deal with some of the inequity that we see in your research. And so it is the David Hume Institute, and it is looking at public policy, and it is looking at big ideas. So what might those be? I possibly disagree a little bit, and we can get into this, and I'm sure we'll have some colleagues from Oscar on the call today. I think legislation is part of it, but I don't think legislation should ever be our first port of call in trying to change some of these deep ingrained problems within our society, but particularly within our sector. So we've talked a little bit about public register of trustees. I think that is an absolute requirement and necessity. And I think we do need the legislation, and I think we will have to update the Act. And I think that should just be a given that is now in traction and that's where we should be headed to. But I don't think we have to wait for that. And I think what I took from the research is there are enough people from diverse backgrounds, from diverse life experiences who would be willing to stand up. And I know that Enable Scotland would be one of those to say, let's think about a sort of self-regulation, self-declaration. Let's get some of those top charities to not wait for Oscar and Scottish Government and legislation, because there's quite a bit of legislation happening as we speak just now. So let's not wait for that. And let's look at what we did with fundraising in 2018 and look at some form of platform for self-regulation or self-declaration, where those charities who want to be more transparent, who want to really focus on DE&I, can say we're willing to put our head above the parapet with others and actually publish our trustees. So if I talk about my own charity, we have our trustees on our website, and we also have links to their profiles, so anyone can search on all of the trustees at Enable Scotland and what other organisations are involved in. But I think a centrally held platform, a bit like we did with fundraising regulation, could be a really good way to start that ball rolling without waiting for legislation. The second big public policy idea, I think, in terms of trust and charities, we're all delighted. This 66% number I've heard bandied about a few times now, and it's higher than it's ever been. It's significantly higher than it was 2 years ago, but actually are we as charity leaders satisfied with 66% public trust in charities? I think that should be much higher. I think we should be aiming for, if not complete trust in our charitable institutions, it should be the outlier if someone doesn't trust charities, not a third of our population. So I think we have to be really ambitious. So how can we be ambitious about that? I think what the research is showing us is that people want to understand charities more. So again, some self-regulation, some self-declaration around the cost of running charities. So I think not waiting till we have newspaper headlines in a cycle every year talking about chief exec salaries or talking about the cost of running charities, actually having some really transparent self-declaration, almost like an efficiency rating that says from a charity perspective, this is how much of your money goes directly to the front line. Now, we can do that if we are accountants or we're skilled at looking through Companies House or looking through Oscar at returns, but actually making it available for everybody so that every citizen of Scotland can see directly the charity that they are investing in, and that's what they're doing, they're investing their cash, their trust into our charities. How efficient, how effective are they in delivering their charitable purpose? And again, I think there would be a leadership role for a number of charities to put their head above the parapet with that. And my third thing is a bit more controversial, but I'm putting it out there as a discussion point. We have talked a lot about who sits on charity boards and what they do. We have talked a lot about the interconnectivity between some people who sit on many charity boards, and we know that that happens in Scotland. But I think what we haven't done is looked at what is the solution for widening those people who can sit on charity boards. And there is perhaps something in those people who tend to sit on charity boards will be retired, semi-retired, or have significant executive roles where networking and public profile is part of the day job. But what about everybody else? What about the brilliant marketing director that's sitting in a charity somewhere in Edinburgh that would love to be on a board, but she has 3 children and she's compressed her week to fit all of that in, and actually there's no economic benefit to sitting on a charity board, and she's just working to keep her exec career on track, you know? What about the ordinary citizen who has a lot to offer in terms of the experience of charities and donating to charities, but actually can't get away from the day job because, you know, bluntly, Tesco are never going to give you paid leave. Now, that's no offence to Tesco, I'm just sort of plucking that out of the air. But how do we encourage that? And so I think there has to be a debate and a discussion about remuneration of charity trustees, particularly in larger charities. And I think that's something that would require legislation. That is a longer term issue, but certainly your research was pointing us to, we have a circle of the same people sitting on the same boards often in a small country with a small population. We perhaps have to look at that in terms of how we widen it out. So a number of key things from the research, but for me, I think what's really important are, what are the policy solutions? What are the big ideas that help move that research on, not just in the long term, but in the short and medium term? What are the solutions? So I hope that's helpful in terms of my view of the research.
That's brilliant. Manish, did you want to come back on anything before we open it out for questions from the audience?
No, I think I really like Theresa's point just about, you know, we can't wait for legislation. We have equal opportunities policy. That's stopped that being a barrier and people coming up against things. So I do think there is that leadership role for organisations to play, and also innovation in that too. I think we see some phenomenal innovations across our sector. You know, people do amazing things with limited resources, and actually, you know, if you kind of really harness the power of the sector, I really think you come up with some really quite interesting opportunities. I think sometimes people just get so caught up in the day job and then everything you have to do, regardless of the size of your organisation. But I think actually smaller organisations, that's even harder because, you know, you're really relying on volunteer capacity and other elements. So it's about how do we create, I think, spaces and places for people to have these discussions and to actually come away from them with some tangible opportunities. So I think it's a great place to start discussing that. I think we maybe need to look at more widely in the sector where we can create opportunities for people to have discussions about the challenges that they're facing as well, in terms of where do you find that pipeline. If your network is predominantly, you know, 60-year-old white men, it's going to be really hard for you to maybe find more diverse networks. So I think people also need help in that, and there's maybe a bit of a need for grace from everybody almost, and humility to go, we know nobody's cracked this and nobody's got it figured out, but if you're willing to try and engage in some dialogue and figure it out, then I think actually together we could do some stuff right across the sector. And you know, for me, it's about how those that have some more experience can help others and give everyone a bit of a helping hand, but also create a pipeline. I think it's great to put people from diverse backgrounds into positions, but how are you going to do that at the next board cycle of recruitment? How are you going to do it after that? How are you going to make sure it happens in your organisation? So yeah, it definitely opens up, I think, quite a few questions.
So there's lots of questions coming in. Just before we go to, I'll ask Michael to unmute and ask his question in a minute. But I'm just wondering, the thing that we haven't touched on, we've talked a lot about leading by example and being open about what your own organisation's doing. And some organisations are already doing quite a lot. There's always more we can do. But are the ones that aren't doing it and aren't interested in this, are they a threat to the charity brand as a whole and trust in all charities? Or do you think it's all right because the public would separate the ones that are doing well from the ones that aren't quite so into this?
I'm happy to pick up on that, Susan. I think if I think back to my experience in terms of fundraising regulation, both in Scotland at a UK level, the public are not okay when charities don't do things well. We saw that in terms of donations, in terms of charitable giving, in terms of public trust and confidence. And we rightly don't talk about all of Cook in that time and the selling of data and all of that, you know, the sort of the toxic things that happened. But absolutely, the public are not okay when charities get things wrong. And I would think that it wouldn't be a huge jump to understand that sometimes the public expect the private sector to do things that are sharp in their practices, although I do think that is changing, I have to be honest now. But I do think there is an expectation, the bar is set high in terms of public trust and confidence for charities. So I think it is really important that it's not just some charities, but we try and create an environment for all charities through a much more positive and progressive regulatory or self-regulatory system. We support charities to do more good, but to talk about how they do that good. Just because you're doing good does not mean you're doing it well. And I think we have to be honest about that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Michael, do you want to unmute and ask your question directly?
Yeah, thank you. My question is, do you think this explains why the level of investment and work within communities such as ethnically diverse communities does not result in significant change to address issues experienced if there is no diversity of thought at the senior decision-making level? How does that translate to action and subsequently charity activities to champion the needed change within these communities? Because as we've just seen, you know, the representation, I think, is a main thing. And if that representation is not there, that's the reason why these communities are constantly left behind.
Yeah. Michael, I don't think it's really hard. You can't argue with that point. I think part of the challenge as well is in the relationship that exists often between charities and funders. And so you're often so reliant, I think, on the money you get from your funding partner, and you're having to sometimes fit in your activity to meet the funding requirement. And there's not necessarily somebody championing the cause for those communities at a funding level. I think often on our boards, some of the communities that are being served by those charities, the lived experience isn't always there. And thinking about how you can bring that in, I don't always think it's a case of going, we need to make sure that we've got people from those communities on the board, because sometimes there's barriers to their participation because of their lives, or depends on the type of charity you have. But I think take registered social landlords as an example. I think tenants have a very active role on those boards, and I think that would probably bring a lot of diversity of thought and experience to those boards. I think we could all be doing more to think about how we can do that to engage the communities that we serve. But I think your point is well made in terms of the challenges of that power dynamic, and I think that exists, across all our services. You think about local government and how services are provided, don't often have a voice in their influencing some of that.
Thanks, Manish. We've got so many questions now. I'm just going to whiz through some. James Joplin, I'm going to come to you. You've got a comment in there, which would be good to air with the wider group in your own words. But also I'd like to ask you, because you've specialised over the last few years in working for UK-wide organisations. So any reflections you have on that, because they're not covered in this research? Is there anything different that you have experienced because you worked for much bigger organisations across the whole of the UK? Do you want to unmute and add your comment in?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just writing about a third comment, but my fingers were on fire by that point. And I think it's interesting that there aren't cross-border charities included in your analysis, and I understand why. But if you think about the household names that most members of the public would recognise, they would tend to be Macmillan, Cancer Search UK, British Heart Foundation, organisations like that. Now, as we know, the Charity Commission do have a search for website of trustees, and as I just noted that they also include other places those people hold trusteeships, which I think in terms of your own investigations as a donor or individual, to understand the big or smallness of that trustee community is really critical. The point I was just writing out there, but I'll maybe use the microphone space to make, is, and agree strongly with Theresa's point there about how accessible we make trusteeship as something people can do, is I think you know, we all have a duty to do something more than just put an ad in Good Moves, go to our local TSI and put it on our website, because that assumes a massive knowledge and understanding about what the duties of a trustee involve. And if I think about British Art Foundation, the way we approach a greater equity and understanding of recruitment of volunteers, I think we need to translate that mindset into recruiting trustees. We seem to view them as something different and distinct, whereas actually a lot of charities are very, very open-minded and forthright about how they need a more diverse volunteer force. Well, a trustee is a volunteer, but I think we don't tend to think of them in the same way as this kind of like specialist hybrid person who can only be certain things. And I think that's where we're missing a trick, because if we just go to the same places, we're going to just see the same faces.
Thanks, James, and thanks for bringing up the Charity Commission website. The reason we haven't used that as a model, and the reason we've used the Companies House one, is it's much harder to do the cross correlation. And what I don't really understand, but I'm a non-technical person, is you access both the Companies House register and the Charity Commission register through the Gov UK website. So the back end, surely, for the Charity Commission website could be the same as Companies House and could have the same functionality. So when you click on an individual, you can see everything listed, and you just don't have that. The Charity Commission one is still fiddly. You know, if you're trying to cross correlate data on individuals, it's much harder. So that's why we didn't use that as a model. And we do think it's about how you hold people to account, but why should company directors have much higher level of transparency than charity trustees when they've got the responsibility for public benefit? So that was kind of why we used that as a model in terms of equality of responsibility. Theresa, did you want to come in on anything James said?
Yes, I want to pick up on James's point around creating a more diverse board. And, you know, I'm not holding up Enable Scotland as being perfect, but we have done a lot of work on this over the past 5 years in particular. So we've gone from a position of having 0% of our trustees from ethnically diverse backgrounds to 15%. We now have 30% representation from women on our board. And I think that's much more reflective of our workforce. But we did that with intentionality. So it's a bit like James was talking about there. We didn't just leave it to a headhunter to go out and find skills. We didn't just leave it to tapping people on the shoulder. What we actually did was took a really comprehensive approach to what are the skills we need from an Oscar trustee position. So what skills do we need on the board? But how do we match those skills across a much more diverse trustee board and actually look into and reach and make the effort to reach into those communities that are not normally served by a typical Scottish charity? So we now have some brilliant people on our board, people like Rupa Muker, who is a huge advocate for not just boards and trusteeships, but DE&I. Chris Yu, who many on this call will know, who's now the European Policy Director for Meta, but very focused on DE&I as a way forward for all organisations. That didn't happen because we A, put an advert with a headhunter, or B, tap people on the shoulder. It happened because we had a very intentional reach out to a number of different networks to say, these are the skills we need, but these are the communities that we have to represent, and doing both together, I think, is really powerful. And that has certainly helped us on that journey. We've also had some support from Manish. So I was delighted to see Manish's name on today's lecture, but Manish has helped us not just at a board level, but at a grassroots level, try to do some of that stuff that James has talked about. And so Manish, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Theresa. Yeah, I think, you know, this isn't the work of a couple of weeks. You're going to sort it out with a campaign. I think this is about going deeper within the communities that you serve, trying to understand those communities. I think back to Theresa's earlier point about building trust. You know, we've got to build trust with a lot of communities. You know, there's communities out there that don't always understand how the charity sector works or how the charity operates. So I think it's about having a presence within those communities at a grassroots level, explaining what it means to be involved with them, and taking your time to build that trust up, and then inviting them in. And I think it's got to be a two-way thing. So you've got to give something back as well as be asking for something from them as well. So I think it does take time, and I think it's not a one size fits all. So what works in the central belt of Scotland might not work in the Highlands, but I think you've got to try and find what works for you in terms of both your charity and your charitable objectives, but also within the community that you're serving. And you know, there isn't necessarily 70% of the community in the Highlands and Islands is not from ethnic minority backgrounds, but there will be people there that you can look to talk to. And maybe not everyone wants to take on a trustee's role, but they can help inform your decision making and can help inform your direction of travel, I think. And I think even just speaking to people outside of your normal network can make a massive difference.
Brilliant, thank you. Notice Martin Tyson from Oscar has commented in the chat. Martin, would you like to unmute and feedback anything in person?
Yeah, thanks very much, Susan. As you know, make the point there, transparency is absolutely key in this respect, and you know, in some of the other respects, including the kind of use of funds that Theresa mentioned. I think one of the key things there, and I think that sort of self-regulation piece is very relevant here, is publication of accounts and trustee annual reports. That's where you can get these messages out. That's where you can be held to account in terms of what you're doing on those diversity issues. I think one of the interesting things now, I'd maybe ask you to you know, if there's any sort of further comment on this, Susan. One of the interesting things in the report was about, you know, what the reflection might be for charities sort of, you know, below that top 300 level, and I'm thinking about the kind of local you know, local community-based charities that we deal with day in, day out, and what the diversity picture might be in those, because although the income is with the ones that you've looked at, the people, or the majority of the people, I think 160,000 trustees or so that we think are out there, the majority of the people are with those other charities. And you know, I just wonder if you have any sense of where that might be.
Oh, Theresa's got a hand up before I say it. Go on, you go first.
Oh, Martin, it's such a brilliant point. And can I quote one of our former ministers who once said very publicly, there are almost 250,000 trustees in Scotland. The problem is most of them don't know what that means. And I think his point was exactly as you said there, that the majority of trustees are just doing great jobs in their community, in small charities that perhaps don't even have any employees in the charity, without totally understanding the legal duties and responsibilities of being a trustee. And often they're coming from a place that is brilliant and good, particularly with lived experience or parents and carers. And we see that a lot in the field of disability, Martin, and community-based disability charities. We need to support people to, one, understand what it means to be a charity trustee and some of the decisions they'll be asked to make, but two, to really understand the idea of what are your legal responsibilities, because one of the things that we haven't touched on the report is the depth of knowledge that is required around charity law that trustees should have. And it shouldn't be a sort of, you know, mystified process. It's not beyond everyone to become a charity trustee. Anyone can become a charity trustee, but it's what's the scaffolding and support we have to put around them to support that to happen. And I think that that's a hugely important point, and one that's very close to my heart. Sorry, Susan, I jumped into your question there.
Fine, I could see was Manish wanting to come in there as well.
No, listen, I'm not going to push your time. I think just very two quick points from the back of what Theresa was saying there, though, was about the scaffolding piece. So I think many charities are quite good at that, you know, recruitment and induction to an extent. Obviously, they're not being as diverse as they could, but it kind of stops there for a lot of people a lot of time. And actually, trusteeship for me is a lifelong thing. Hopefully, for people, they stay engaged with maybe 1 or 2 or 3 different organisations through the course of their life. It's a good experience. It's not always a good experience, but I think making sure we've got a good kind of peer support network around that. Like, I think at the moment, charity trusteeship kind of just lives in its bubble. We kind of give it a profile in Trustees Week. You know, I think Elaine's put some good organisations there that are focused on that. But again, I think people don't come together necessarily to talk about the issues and the challenges that they're facing as trustees. You know, but SCDO's The Gathering will be back later this year. Those are great opportunities, but I think how do we do longer term engagement around that, and how do we increase, I guess, the capacity and the capabilities of our trustees so that they're improving constantly in that respect?
I won't save the time by not talking on this one, I think, if that's all right. I'm going to come to Pat at Cosvo, because I know that you've worked on the Third Sector Governance Forum for many years, and part of that was looking at trustee induction as one of those things. So I'm bypassing the question you've had, but you can lump it all together, Pat, if you've got time to unmute and bring all those points together.
Sure, thanks, Susan. And yeah, it's really interesting hearing from both Manish and Theresa, because some of the points that you've been bringing up around support and recruitment, I think, cross both governance and leadership. And the point I was going to bring in is that, you know, we've done a recent study with current third sector leaders. 53% plan to leave the role within the next 5 years, and of those 71% within the next 2 years. So there's going to be a huge movement of leadership over the next while. Interestingly, many of the leaders are saying they're not retiring, they're going on to other roles in the sector. And anecdotally, we're hearing that senior staff don't necessarily want to step up to the chief exec role. So there's something about how do we support the pipeline of new leaders coming in and their transition to that leadership role, but within a way that encourages more diversity in the people that are moving into those roles, and looking at what the barriers are to stop them moving into the roles. And is there something for us to take on responsibility of leaders of making these roles seem more attractive and more doable? Because the other thing that came out of the study was the level of burnout that people are being affected by at the moment. And I suppose finally, for those that are leaving and moving out of the role, is there a higher proportion? Will it make the diversity worse? Are there more women leaving because the juggling act of the last 2 years has been more difficult? And that's something we've not been able to explore further. So I think there's potentially some really good opportunities to address some of the issues, but I think there's a much more wraparound way of how do we support those transitions and how do we drill down further into some of the statistics that we're starting to find. And I think that's a real challenge for us all just now. We're all so focused on the day job and keeping our organisations alive that being able to step back and look at that bigger picture and how we future think is a real challenge for leaders in the sector.
Thanks, Pat. I think one of the things your research really brought out was the burnout rate that charity leaders are facing at the moment. And I think we were, there was one occurrence of this, but it's the first time we've had it when we've been doing this research of 2 people co-leading an organisation. And I think that's a really good sign, because it does mean that, you know, the sector's beginning to embrace flexible working at a leadership level, and that might begin to, you know, help more people see that the traditional idea of what a leader is and what they look like might and could be very different in future. You know, it isn't one size fits all, and maybe that will begin to challenge the conscious and unconscious bias that is on recruitment panels at the moment. I'm doing a really poor job of managing to get through all the questions at the moment. There are tons. Lang, you've do you want to unmute and ask your question on cross-border charities again? I'm really aware that WWF, the organisation you work for, have been doing quite a lot on this, so I'd really be interested to hear your reflections.
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks also to the panelists. It's been really interesting, and like the others, I think it's only until you see we kind of figure this is what you'd see, but once you see the figures, they are quite scary. So as you say, you can only change what you can measure. So we've got somewhere to start at the very least. Yeah, so I'm the director of a UK-wide charity, the Scottish wing of it, and you know, it's, last year I led the UK part on their DE&I work from Scotland, which was an interesting project to work on. But I guess as for me, a question, I'll maybe add to my own question and hear what the other panelists got. I see there's pros and cons of the UK-wide charities. I think the pro is we may have some of the resources that are desperately needed for some of the smaller organisations in Scotland, and so therefore I think we should use our privilege in some respects of that resource to help others. And I've been recently working with others in my sector to try and make sure there's capacity and resource there on race and racism, but hopefully that will benefit the wider DE&I. But that's the type of thing I think we can be doing as leaders of the Scottish wings of, or the devolved wings of UK charities. I think there's a con though, and cons in the sense of, if I'm honest, there are many UK organisations, and I include my own here, whose understanding, whether it be the law, culture, politics of their devolved outfits, means either they have a lack of interest or a lack of understanding, which means you're kind of having to pull all the time or push against that all the time in order to try and do something which feels right in your own space. So I say I see the pros and the cons even inside my own organisation. But I think, you know, on that privilege part, if we're leaders of organisations, irrespective of cross-border or not, I think we have to use our role very much to do this. So, for example, I sit in another, we're talking about multiple trustees. I'm the chair of another trust or trusts, and this week I'll actually be sitting on interview panels for new trustees. And I've used my role as chair to insist that in that search for new trustees, we're going to go big on diversity of you know, as many of the prescribed characteristics as we can look at. A bit like Theresa was talking about, we've got the luxury of kind of using headhunter resource not only to look for the right skills, but for the right people. And so that I don't think that would be happening had I not insisted upon it happening as part of the intake of new trustees. But I'm glad it is. Let's see what comes out. Anyway, so it wasn't really a question, maybe some comments.
Thanks, Lang. I think that's a really good example of championing change and something Theresa brought up earlier. And I know from when I've been asked to be an independent extra on a panel, you do have a lot of influence. And you can give a reflection back to the organisation that maybe they wouldn't get if you weren't there. So I think any individual that is in a position to be on a recruitment panel for another organisation can use their experience in a lot of different ways to challenge that organisation. Manish, I can see you nodding on that.
Yeah, no, I think just to come in on that, I think something I've been reflecting on is we can so often be guilty of recruiting in our own image. So we try to find, or we just, you know, because of our own bias or because we think that's what the organisation needs, we recruit in our own image. So I think being able to diversify recruitment panels and bring in independent voices, I was kind of smirking because I was on a panel and I gave a contrarian view to the rest of the panel, and it was another organisation that chose to go against my view. But I advocated for the female candidate who brought something different that I thought shone through. But it's interesting as well. I think sometimes you can do all these things and actually might end up with the same result because the organisation wants to go in a certain direction. And I think some of that again is back to leadership and governance too. So I think, you know, diversity as a governance issue. You know, you talk in the report about risk as well, and I think there's a significant number of those organisations viewed the lack of diversity as a risk. But again, what are you doing about it? How are you reporting it? Has it been discussed at your senior management meetings? Has it been discussed at board level? And then where's the accountability on it? You know, and I think I don't think we think about it as a governance issue all that much. I think sometimes it sits within HR or it sits, you know, within your people strategy, but I think it needs to be sitting right at the very top. And we're seeing organisations now, I think certainly in the private sector, EDI roles are now C-suite roles. You've got people sitting, you know, at the top table now, not in HR, but very much looking at EDI cross-cutting right across the organisation. And I think we can learn from that as a sector.
Susan, two things from my perspective to pick up on what Lang said. Looking to other UK organisations, we don't have to look exclusively to other UK charities. I think that's interesting, Lang, from a WWF perspective. But one of the really important pieces of work we did was with the BBC. So we really reached into the BBC and some of the progress they had made in terms of DE&I and looked at some of their senior people and some of the programmes and projects they had run, and actually have tried to bring them back to Enable Scotland in a way that is relevant to Enable Scotland, to our demographic, but actually using their success and not trying to reinvent the wheel, but going quickly to organisations that have been doing some of this stuff for 5-10 years, looking at what has worked and transferring it back. And I think that's a really crucial question for trustees to ask of their exec teams. Who are you looking at? Who's your benchmark exemplar of how you want to improve DE&I for our charity? I think it's a hugely important question. And to Manish's point, if I may, just in terms of how you bring in that extra expertise, it was a lovely coincidence to have Manish on the panel today. He is about to join the Enable group as an ambassador for DE&I on a part-time basis. So Manish, I'm not sure if I was supposed to announce that today, because I know it's not probably written up in the contract. I'm sure our lawyer at Enable saying you shouldn't have done that, but I think it's a really important point that we looked out to who we think is a role model in this sector who's doing great work, and have asked Manish to come in and support us on a very much a consultative part, not on a trustee basis, but in a paid role to come and help us. And I think that's where we have to think much more about what roles do we need to support DE&I. It's not just the executive role and it's not just the trustee role. We from time to time have to reach into communities and pay people to come and support us, and not just expect it to be done as a favour or goodwill, because I don't think we get the traction required if that's how we move forward.
Thanks, Theresa. We have got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to whiz through some of the questions and allow both of you to pick which ones you want to answer. There's Paula from Oscar who's saying, do you think there's a problem with lack of understanding in society about charity trustee role and who's in charge of charities and what a charity is? There's one from Claire Stevens at Voluntary Health Scotland about, is it different for charities where there are a membership base? I mean, we did see a very stark difference in the research where for registered social landlords and housing associations who have a much more likelihood of having their tenants on the board, so that might be different if either of you have got any reflections on that. And there are lots of recommendations of places to see about trustee information, including Changing the Chemistry, who we do mention in the report. And Chris O'Sullivan from the Mental Health Foundation, is there something about a development track for potential CEOs to gather more experience, to bringing a whole load of different people? I simply can't manage to get through all of those, but the ones we haven't got to, we will try and share somehow afterwards. I'm not quite sure how we'll do it, but we'll find a way to try and answer some of those questions. So over to you both for your final thoughts and comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it's been great to see the chat box so alive and so many questions coming in. It's clearly this is a topic people want to talk about, and I think try to create spaces for that is maybe something we could take away from this and think about how we do more of that, I guess, as we come out of the pandemic as well and can get back to more face-to-face interactions. There are some great practitioners as well, I think, in Scotland who are working on this. I don't think we have as many people as there are south of the border who are working on some of this work around DD&I within the sector, but I think there are some really interesting people in Scotland that we could, expand and look at doing something with this. I think from my perspective, I think we all need to challenge our basic assumptions. I think we can often come into these things thinking, the charity should be a certain way, and I think it's about challenging our basic assumptions on that and our own bias that exists, much of that through society and our lived experience, but I think we have a duty to challenge that. I think intentionality seems to have come out quite strongly through the call here, and I think Theresa and I did a piece actually, I think last year now, with Nina Goswami from the BBC, and she talked a lot about the programmes they've got in their culture unit and the intentionality that has gone in there to target very specific groups. And you're now starting to see some of the fruits of those labours, on our TV screens and the writers that are writing for the BBC, but it's taken a long time. So I think, but being intentional about what you do to build that pipeline, I think creating more opportunities to talk about things can only be a positive thing for the sector. It's really great to hear from Martin there. Got the regulator in the room. I think I have a really good relationship across the sector with the regulator, so we should build on that and try and take that forward. And from my perspective, I think just taking this head on, tackling the structural and institutional elements that exist, in higher education. There is no doubt we have institutions here in Scotland that are hundreds of years old. They were involved in the slave trade. They were involved in, elements that are institutionally racist. I think we have to, face up to that, but then also try and figure out what we're doing about that and then pass that learning on. So, I'm at Strathclyde University. We have a race equality working group. We have a lot of work. We have researchers here who are doing work on race. I think it's making sure we share that information, disseminate it, and talk about what's working well and where some of the challenges are. So I think try to create more spaces for that would be helpful. And I think finally for me, I think treating diversity as a governance issue and as a risk within your risk register and putting steps in place to tackle that as you would anything else in your organisation.
Thanks, Manish. Theresa?
So I'll just use my closing minute, if I can, just on the three big policy things, just to get us sort of thinking about this beyond today's debate. The Register of Trustees not waiting for legislation, but actually is there a role for Martin and Oscar to support some coming together of some charities to put their head above the parapet and do that in a self-declaration format and actually push it forward. We don't have to wait for the legislation, I would argue. Transparency over costs, yes, they are in your annual accounts and in your review, but a central allocation where you can search on how a charity is run from a financial perspective that is accessible to non-financial individuals, I think is really important. And we haven't touched on FOI, but I think we need to in this debate, but we simply don't have the time to do that today. And then the third point, and I notice some people agree and some people disagree on the paying of charity trustees. I do not have a firm view on that, but what I have is a firm sense we have to have that debate, a firm sense that we have to look at what works for some RSLs in Scotland and for some private sector organisations, and is there any learning in terms of trusteeship and that responsibility you take on, particularly in larger charities, that we should have that discussion and that debate. So I'm not sitting on the fence. I'm saying that we have to have a discussion and a debate that looks in the pros and cons in order to make sure we get much more diversity on our boards.
Thanks, Theresa, and thanks, Manish, and thanks to the whole audience for really great questions. And I'm really sorry we couldn't get through them all. I'm 1 minute over, so I'm just going to sum up very, very quickly. We've got lots of food for thought. We're really pleased that the research has provided food for thought, provoked discussion. It is the start of a discussion, I think. I think there is much more work to do. I think some of the examples that have been said today would be brilliant case studies to share. I mean, even when I get an email from Lang and he's got a very interesting footer on his, and I said, oh, that's really good. What can I learn from that? Because obviously WWF have done a lot of work on this. So it is time to draw the event to the close, but it's not the end of the conversation. And I'd like to thank everyone for being involved, but please do stay involved and please do all take on the mantle that both Manish and Theresa have said, which is it's time for all of us to champion the change that we want to see. So let's go forth and do that. And we hope to see you all again soon at the next event. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Susan. Thanks, Manish.
Thanks.